Greetings, this is the Grumpy Old Slan, and today we're going to take a look at the May 1924 issue of Weird Tales. So as we can see from the cover, this is the first anniversary issue. It proclaims to have 50 distinct feature novels, short stories, and novelettes, full of thrills, mystery, and adventure. We see the exclamation marks so often associated with pulp fiction on this cover, which also features an image of the pyramids and the Sphinx. Now, being an anniversary issue, this issue has twice the page count at close to 200. It still has a table of content at the end of the magazine. Now, you may take a look at this and say, wait a minute, there's less than 50 stories listed here, and you'd be right. There are only 39 items listed here, including Ask Houdini and the Weird Crimes column by Seabury Quinn. What will happen is that at the end of stories, we'll have like a quarter page feature or little tidbit, more or less fictional. This is where I think they get the 50 from. At the beginning of the magazine, we have an editorial asking why Weird Tales, and they're basically talking about how what they're doing is unique and different from all the other fiction, about how some classics of weird literature, they give the example of Murders in the Rue Morgue, would have a problem finding a market if it wasn't for Weird Tales. They also divide weird fiction into two large categories, one of which is an exploration of the supernatural and the paranormal, and the other one which they call highly imaginative stories, which from their description, these are stories of advancement in the sciences and the arts to which the generation of the writer who creates them has not attained. That sounds like science fiction to me, but science fiction did not yet exist. And they give examples of what they consider to be highly imaginative fiction. As examples, they list Homer, Shakespeare, Milton, Dante, Irving, Hawthorne, Poe, Verne, Dickens, Maeterlinck, Doyle, Wells, and scores of other lesser lights. So to describe what this fiction is, they quote Huxley, who said that those who refuse to go beyond fact rarely get as far as fact. So you have to imagine things in order to be able to move science forward, is the argument. And this kind of fiction allows us to do that. And this is still a dynamic that people discuss today in the world of science fiction. Quite forward-looking here. The first story is Imprisoned with the Pharaohs by Houdini, which is another one of the supposedly true tales of his adventures. In it, he visits Egypt on a trip, doing the tourist thing, hires a guide. He ends up going at night on top of one of the pyramids with the guide and a group of other people. It turns out to have been a setup. Everyone turns on him, they capture him, they tie him up, and they lower him into a nearby hole, which is very deep. He's partly unconscious. He wakes up. He's in midair, going down. He feels forever until he's lowered to the ground. He, of course, manages to untie himself and explores the cave and sees things that are unnatural. But he does make his way out and tells people how strange and horrifying what he saw is. I would have preferred for this to just be a regular story, remove the whole Houdini element. This is clearly not a true story. It's also doubly disappointing because it ends with this whole eldritch horror, all these strange supernatural things. And meanwhile, in the letters column, Houdini advocates for using some common sense and critical thinking when confronted with seances and people who claim to speak with the dead and things like that. The two messages seem to be at odds with each other. The story itself was okay. Like I said, we should just remove the whole Houdini thing and just have some random adventurer there instead. There's also a few inconsistencies. When he's captured, he's apparently with his wife, but then she's never mentioned for the rest of the story, for example. Could have used a bit of editing there, I believe. Next is a short story called Whoso Digggeth. This short story is about a man who joins the crew of an oil drill. He's a bit odd, but people learn to accept him. However, he seems to be taking advantage of a young woman who delivers and picks up the laundry for the workers. This woman is also not all there, so clearly taking advantage of someone who doesn't have the mental capacity to know any better. For this reason, the foreman will fire him. He will decide to take his revenge. His plan is to light a cigarette, climb up on one of the oil tanks, and drop it in. He falls in the tank and is trying to stay afloat in the oil when he realizes that the crude oil doesn't burn well, but it has started to burn from his cigarette, which was already lit when he fell. No one knows he's there. He chose an isolated tank away from where most people were, and he will die a horrible death there. Nothing supernatural, just an unpleasant character dying an unpleasant death. So that was a bit disappointing. It's followed by another short tale, Deep Calleth, by Gordon Burns. This is about a love triangle of sorts. It's a man who fell in love at first sight, married his love after only a month. Though he sometimes feels he doesn't quite know her, he still loves her very much. He runs a plantation with a partner. However, this person can be very violent sometimes, which basically means the main character can never quite feel true friendship can blossom between the two men. However, for some reason, his wife does get along with him quite well. The three are having supper and they notice this large ape, described as 7 feet tall, looking at them from the edge of the woods. Something it's been doing quite regularly for the past few months. The wife and the partner decide to go for a walk. While they're on a walk, it becomes clear that they're more than just friends. At this point, a large coconut is thrown from one of the trees, hitting the man, leaving him unconscious or dead. And the large ape will grab the woman and run off into the woods. Not as big, but it's the King Kong to her Fay Ray 9 years early. A little disappointing. We don't know what happens afterwards, and it's what happens afterwards that makes King Kong a good story. The next story is The Malignant Entity by Otis Aldebert Kline. This one about a professor and a writer friend of his who are enlisted to help out a policeman in solving a mystery he's faced with. Said mystery is about a doctor who was researching the creation of life from non-living matter, who is found dead in his laboratory. Specifically, only his skeleton is found. It's known to be him because of traces of past injuries on the bones, like a broken arm, and from his dentist identifying the teeth as being those of the doctor. Apparently, 3 weeks previously, the doctor had gotten to a breakthrough in his research, which made him quite happy, but no one quite knows what he's done and how he's done it. And it turns out that there's a large container containing some sort of jelly-like liquid. It is actually living matter. They will discover what it is. They will attempt to destroy it by pouring acid on it, but a small part of it will escape. They're worried because this thing can eat any living matter. They have evidence that the doctor had fed it various animals, starting with microscopic things. As it grew larger, he fed it larger and larger animals until he himself was attacked by it. Now they managed to recapture it and destroy it. They've captured it in a jar, and they put the jar in the fire, hoping that the heat will destroy it. And as it sort of bubbles and stuff, it shapes itself into the face of someone, which at first the professor and his writer friend believed to be some random shape, imagination assigning this to a face, and the policeman goes, no, this was the exact face of this outlaw who was killed 3 weeks before. This lends credence to the professor's theory that in the universe you have matter and you have what they call force. In order to have something living, you also need a soul, And so presumably the soul of this killer managed to enter the artificial life created by the doctor and started growing and feeding. And because this was a merciless killer, the creature is also merciless and dangerous. And so this was another one of those gray goo, giant amoeba that eats everything type stories. Well told. I can't complain about that. The characters are following the clues in a reasonable manner. They don't make stupid decisions, which is always refreshing in stories like that. We still see stories today where people make stupid decisions that no one in their right mind would do. And here, they make mistakes, but they don't make mistakes because they're being idiots. They make mistakes because they don't realize what's happening. They course correct as events develop. I quite enjoyed this one. Next is The Sixth Tree by Edith Lighty Stewart, which I have read. I have linked to in the description. I won't need to recap here, but it was a quite enjoyable tale. Most of the tale is from a diary, and the opening paragraph seems to be a document explaining whose diary it is and that this person was found dead. So we see the last few days what he wrote in his diary. I quite enjoyed this one, and I hope you will too. The Haunted Mansion in the Pines by Leonard F. Schumann is, as one would expect, about a haunted house. Everyone who stays in it decides to leave. They don't stay. This is a story of the last tenants of the house. They discover that the ghost was actually a homeless veteran of the First World War who had a grudge against the original owner of the house because that person was on the draft board that forced him to go to war, and he had a horrible time in the trenches and wanted to get back at him and has been hiding in the barn, causing strange things to happen in the house and stealing people's food to survive. So this story was a bit of a letdown for me. I'm not super fond, as I've mentioned before, of haunted houses. The last few paragraphs, boom, we have the explanation. Here it is, with no hints previously, which is too bad. Next, we have Spirits by J.M. Alvey. This is a short one-page story about a man who's coming home late at night, taking a shortcut down a road that has a reputation for not being a good place to be at night. As he approaches a tree, he sees there's a body hanging from it, and the body starts to talk to him, offering him some blood. He's reminded of sermons that the local preacher has been given about respecting the dead and all that, and he doesn't want it. Eventually, he's convinced to put $2 in the hanged man's pockets, which he does. Then he falls to his knees, prays to God. When he opens his eyes, the hanged man is gone, and he thinks, oh my God, I've seen a ghost. And then he finds in front of him a bottle. When he opens it to smell it, it's filled with alcohol. At that point, he hears a voice come from the tree saying, yeah, go home, you fool. Clear out, my next customer is coming soon. That's the end of the story. So it was a humorous little tale. It was enjoyable for the few minutes it takes to read. It's then followed by Hypnos by H.P. Lovecraft, a rather standard Lovecraft tale outside the Cthulhu mythos, apparently, about two men who delve into the mysteries of the dream world. They keep their youth for quite a while, and then they age at an accelerated rate, and they're also afraid to sleep. The narrator, one of those two men, is also a sculptor. They've gone off the deep end in many ways, and they're out of money. As his partner falls asleep, he sees an otherworldly light shine and screams in horror at it. And then people say, well, no, you didn't sell all your sculptures. Look, you have this one left, and it's the semblance of his friend made out of marble. A fairly standard Lovecraft tale about people researching knowledge that no one should know and dying and going insane because of it. So then we have the conclusion of Ebenezer's Casket by J.U. Giesy and Junius B. Smith. As you may recall, this was the story of a man who, quote unquote, knew when he was going to die and made arrangements for that. He ends up waking up the next morning very much alive. And then we find out why he knew the hour of his death. And that's because he believed some seer who saw it in his crystal ball and in the stars. And he will go to see this person, say, look, I made arrangements thinking I'd be dead because I believed you. And then he shows his naivete is still not gone because the charlatan tells him, oh, I made a mistake. The stars were right. I just misplaced one arcane symbol. They didn't say you would die. They say you'd go broke. He then will go to the funeral home where he'd made arrangements for his burial. At first, the funeral home owner is reluctant to give him back the money, saying that he'll bury him when the time comes. And then he says, well, there's a casket that should have been delivered. Can I sell it to you? The funeral home offers him 1/5 the wholesale price. Eventually, he comes to find out that the casket has been sold to somebody else and there's already a body in. And he finds out the body needs to go back east to a little town that turns out to be very close to his hometown. He makes a deal with the funeral home, since the casket needs to be accompanied by a caretaker, that he will be the caretaker to not be sued for having sold a casket that already belonged to someone else. He gets some money out of the deal. And when he gets back to his hometown, he gets back in touch with his sweetheart, and there's a happy ending for both of them. Disappointing ending. The main character felt so convinced he was going to die and was acting in a very matter-of-fact way about it. Turns out he was just totally bamboozled by someone claiming to be able to tell the future. And now we have the final chapters of Draconda by John Martin Leahy. In this one, we finally find out how come Draconda has been to Earth, and it turns out that she remembers her past lives. She says she's 125 years old and she's lived 4 lives, and I figure if I was to remember my past lives, I'd try to live longer than 25 years. The one hero she's in love with will settle with her, and the other one will take a friend and decide to go on further adventures. Before that happens, they have managed to cobble together a wireless set which allows them to transmit this story to Earth. So very much the romantic explorer returning with stories that aren't very filled with actual knowledge. Very different from what actually happens when people go out and explore these days, where that was a okay conclusion, though the whole past life thing seems to come out of nowhere a little bit. I do know a lot of people really believe that was the case back then. Some people still do. Let's see what other very long story they're going to come up with in the future. Then we have The Hand by H. Francis Caskey. This one about a man who, going to his hotel room, actually enters the room below his, in which he finds 3 men and a woman, and on the table in front of them is a hand, and they explain to him that they've got a brand new anesthetic that will prevent blood from flowing and pain. As evidence, they show the hand which has just been cut off the young lady, and now they're going to do a second operation, and he's horrified and he will run away. Eventually, he will wake up in his room. The next morning, he will inquire as to who was in the room below his, and he finds out it is somebody who's a hypnotist who will, as a joke, make people see horrible, horrible things. The first part of the story was fascinating. I just find the conclusion to be rather disappointing, as it falls into that but it was all a dream type of conclusion. Next is The Love Dead by C.M. Eddy Jr. This one is a life story of a young man who is not only fascinated with death, he loves being in the presence of bodies, so gets a job at a mortuary. Eventually that turns out to not be enough, and he will go and kill people, varying the ways he does it so people don't think it's a serial killer. He will be discovered because he takes greater and greater risks. What we're reading is the written account of his life that he leaves behind. It ends with him doing away with himself, and we see the last words he writes as he can write no more at the very end. So pretty horrific tale of essentially a psychopath. Really well written. Much better, in my opinion, than The Ghost Eater, which was in the previous issue. I know this writer has written a lot of other short stories, some of them co-written with H.P. Lovecraft, and in some of the description of the horribleness of things, we can definitely see the Lovecraftian aspects of this story. Next is The Vow on Halloween by Lyllian Huntley Harris, about a young lady whose family has fallen on hard times. Her father would like to marry a man who's rather well-to-do, but she thinks he's a horrible person and doesn't want to be with him. However, he's quite smitten with her. He will at one point offer to take her on a ride in his car, which she refuses, and he will vow that one day she will ride with him, whether she likes it or not, and he leaves in anger. And then it's found out that he has an accident in his car, probably because of careless driving due to his state of mind. She'll have a dream where she will encounter him and be forced to take the ride in his car that he vowed she would take one way or another. And the story ends with her found rigidly sitting in a car, unable to leave it, on the side of the road, sitting next to a skeleton. Most of the story is just spent on the setup, and it is only maybe the last quarter that is spent with the supernatural tale of it. So it comes rather quickly and is not described much. In fact, it starts as a dream, so it could or could not be real until the very last few paragraphs. Okay, but nothing super memorable. I suspect I'll forget this one relatively quickly. Next, we have Eyes by Galen C. Collin. This one about a young medical student who's about to graduate, who has put it in his head that he wants a skeleton for his office when he becomes a doctor. However, he cannot really afford one. He barely earns enough to cover his expenses, but he really wants one. And he will decide to just go grab one where there's hundreds, namely a cemetery. He will start digging. When he reaches the coffin and opens it up, what he does not expect is for the skeleton to be looking back at him with bright blue eyes. And he flees in terror and goes to a friend to confess what he did and what happened. The next day, his friend tells him, "Oh, you should read the paper." And his friend reads him a little article stating how the grave of this person was vandalized and how this attorney was, in his life, the only blind attorney. When he was buried, his two glass eyes were obviously still there and they wouldn't rot away, and that's what he saw. This was a lovely little twist. We totally expect at first that the blue eyes haunting this doctor are actually from a supernatural source, and it turns out to be an everyday normal explanation for it. Often these are disappointing, but this one was surprising enough. The whole setup and build-up is really well written, so I quite enjoyed this one. Next is The Man Who Thought He Was Dead by Granville Haas. The narrator of this story recalls an old roommate of his who at some point had a dream wherein a spectral figure appeared telling him to put his affairs in order and that he will be back for him a few days later. This dream terrifies him. On the night that the spectre said he'd come back, the next morning he doesn't get up, and when they go to him, he appears to be dead. As they try to wake him, they hear him say, "I died at 3 this morning. The spectre kept its word." They go get a doctor to try and get him to wake up because they can't seem to be able to do so. The doctor examines him. He does appear to be dead, except for the fact that there's still a spark of life And this, even though his body actually starts to decompose, they still try to get him to wake up until his death actually does come true. Reminiscent in some ways of the Poe story about the case of Aldemar, where they hypnotize somebody on the moment of death and he's sort of in this in-between state, although this is for another reason. I think it was an okay story, fairly well put together. The characters are also quite nicely outlined for such a short piece. It's only 2 pages long. It's quite worth checking out if you're into those kinds of stories. Next is Called Back by Dan W. Todderin. This one about a journalist who talks about a revelation he recently had about a murder that happened years before, where the accused kept saying he was innocent and that it was his brother Peter who did the deed, the catch being that his brother died a few years before. One of the people who was peripherally involved will contact this journalist saying, what happened is that the dead brother was called back to the land of the living briefly, and it appears would have taken over his brother's body. The brother knew what was happening but couldn't prevent the takeover of his body. The story concludes with one of those, I present to you the facts as they have been told to me, do with them what you want. I felt it was a bit long and drawn out. I didn't quite get into this story. We'll leave it at that. Next is The Sunken Land by George W. Bailey. This is about a couple of Royal Canadian Mounted Police who are after a couple of murderers. They're trying to follow up the trail. They get to a small village where they meet a doctor whom they know, who sort of goes from village to village and helps out where he can. They find out that that's dead. It turns out to be one of the 2 murderers, and they find clues as to where they had been and where they got sick. They decide to go there and try to find the other party that they're hunting down, and the doctor decides to accompany them. They get to the area and the land is quite rough. It is, as the title implies, the sunken land. As they approach it, they keep going in a general downwards direction. The temperature also seems to go up so that the vegetation becomes more lush. Eventually it's kind of swampy and there's a lot of trees and other vegetation and quite a bit of wildlife. At some point they realize the wildlife is all gone. In the middle of these sunken lands is a lake with in the middle an island which they will reach. It will turn out to be a volcano. The trees of the forest near the lake are actually mobile and will attempt to attack them. When this happens, the only way to safety is in the water. They see an old raft and they will take it to the island where they will find evidence of the 2 people they were hunting down having been there. They devise a plan to get out, which succeeds, make their way back to civilization, and conclude that the second quarry, whose body they didn't find, did try to leave the lake area and failed, and so was consumed by the trees. So an interesting setting in the sense that usually these stories of mobile trees and carnivorous plants are set in a tropical rainforest. There's a bit of a cheat in that they say this is almost like a tropical climate, even though we're in northern Canada. Straight out adventure tale, entertaining enough. This is followed by The Dancing Partner by Guy L. Helms. This one about a young man who the day before his wedding, they're having a party. Someone comes in saying he's seen a ghost. This puts a big damper on the party and he says, well, I'll go and find that ghost and ask it to be my dancing partner. He does go and he will encounter what he thinks is the ghost. When he finally makes his way back, 1, he rode his horse so hard it killed it. And 2, the others say, oh, well, he was attacked by this crazy woman, but we don't know where she comes from because the ghost isn't really described as a woman. She seems to have a physical presence and not be supernatural from what the others are saying. I found it a bit disappointing. Next is the last entry in the Diary of RQP by Meredith Byers, which I have read and I will link to in the description. This is a very brief tale, which I quite enjoyed. A ghost story, but this one with a different twist. Next is The Purple Death by Edith Lyle Ragsdale. This one is set in India, where a dozen men have gone on an expedition to find and exploit a vein of platinum. They've hired a number of locals to help them. As the story starts, one of them has just been found dead in the morning in his tent in very strange circumstances. He's not the first, he's actually the sixth victim. Once a month, one of them has been found dead. Their suspicions fall on one of the locals who's working for them because he found the bodies of several of them. This local runs away, seeming to confirm their suspicions. There's a nearby settlement and temple. They will talk to the people there about what could have caused these deaths because they don't know what it is. And the temple has some people who are healers. They know quite a bit about medicine. Some of them have even studied in the West. There's a pretty good surgeon amongst them. As the tale progresses, they just can't figure out what it is until the night comes when one of them will be attacked. The local who had run away, it turns out he is back. The reason he's back is because he knew if he stayed, he was going to be accused and it would prevent him from figuring out what was happening. And what happened is that it was a Black Panther that was killing the men. They find out that it is a man who felt that a white man had wronged him and he wanted to take revenge on all white men who came in the area. Didn't matter whether they were guilty or not. And he'd arranged for some of the people in the temple to transplant part of his brain into the skull of a panther. Somehow the panther survived the whole thing. His hate for foreigners controlled the panther and caused it to kill white men. One of those weird, not quite supernatural, but certainly fantastical tales. Another variant on the whole transplantation thing. So a good story. It's quite nice that the local who runs away, at first we think, okay, this is very classic trope, but no, he knows there's something to figure out, but he can't stay, or he has to hide in order to figure out what was happening because of the false accusation. Next is The Imposter by Norman Springer. This story starts with a discussion between a doctor and a solicitor about Philip Vallejo, the main character, who the doctor maintains was insane and who recently passed away. He believed that he was someone else in the last year of his life. Turns out that the doctor believes his wife was also a bit mad because she actually believed that was true. The solicitor has a letter from Philip Vallejo with instructions that he had to open them if he passed away. Turns out it's a confession from somebody else entirely. This confession is written a month after the other person passed away, and it's a friend of Philip who it turns out was jealous of Philip for his position in society, but also for his wife. About a year before the discussion that the story opens with, Philip, his friend, and his wife were all in a car, and the car was hit by a train, and the friend passed away. And now, in the letter that the solicitor reads, which is in the handwriting of the dead friend, written a month after his death, he says how both him and Philip were unconscious, and he saw Philip's body with something coming out of his mouth, and he managed to enter the body and inhabit it, animate it, and so while it is Philip's body, it's his soul that's in it. He thinks, great, I'll finally have the woman I love, but she somehow senses that this is not Philip, he's different somehow. Eventually, in despair, he will kill the body of Philip and thus himself. The big twist at the end is that the wife was pregnant. She died giving birth, and it turns out that the child has the features of the dead friend. Clearly a story that came about before things like DNA and stuff were a known thing. Although people did know that you inherited characteristics from your parents, the story plays on the fact that they didn't know what it was, and maybe it was had to do with your soul and not just your physical body. It was an okay story, but again, it's one of those ghost slash possession stories that I don't go for very much. Well told, but forgettable. It's followed by the latest Weird Crimes article by Seabury Quinn. This one is mostly a story of a werewolf near Saint Bonneau and a local hermit. He's actually not a holy man in any way. He just lives as a recluse who's accused of being the werewolf and who will be arrested and condemned. And once the story is told, there's about a quarter page which just points out some facts that we now know but people didn't know back in the 1500s. Things like this recluse would likely not have been condemned to prison or death but been put in an insane asylum because he was clearly suffering from some sort of mental illness. Things like that. I think the story of the werewolf was fun to read. There are a lot of stories of werewolves over the years that people believed were true. The telling is good. It's Seabury Quinn. The little comments at the end give it appearance of factuality. How much of it was actually factual, I don't know, and I'm not going to take the time to verify. The next story is Just Bones by Samuel Stewart Mims. In this one, an old man recalls an event that happened in his youth 50 years before. He was on a camping trip with a friend of his, and they encountered what he will call the Thing, which seems to be some sort of undead, maybe. It seems to have come out of a grave. It so horrified his companion that the companion went insane and eventually died. He still gets nightmares from it. He still has a hard time talking about it. Having recalled what happened 50 years ago, he seems to also be going insane. I found it was a bit disappointing. The thing isn't clearly described. It's described in very ambiguous ways that I felt was very promising, but the ending was quite a disappointment. We do know this one person survives, that the other one went insane. It doesn't quite come together for me, though, like I said, there were some very promising things in it. Next, we have First Degree by Robert Cosmo Harding. This is about a young Chinese man in somewhere in the US. He is in love with a girl. Her dad is quite rich and he's quite poor, so he thinks he has no chance with her. However, she is quite fond of him. Her father does not approve, neither does her brother. He will come into some money. He won a bit of money at the lottery. The father will offer him a job managing a business in another city if he's willing to invest his money in it. However, it's clear from a discussion he has with his son afterwards that the young man's not supposed to come back from this trip. Then the story cuts to a cowboy who finds a dead Chinese man on his property, calls the police, there's an investigation. Girl is heartbroken because she figures out that her dad and her brother killed the man she loved, and then he shows up. It's not clear who, what, when, where, how any of this happened. This was a very disappointing story. In fact, I usually record these magazine recaps over several days. So I read a few stories, record my impressions of them, and so on. And I actually couldn't remember having read this story, which is never a good sign. Next is The Latvian by Herman Fetzer. This one is told by a man who was a ship's captain. He once helped out a Latvian sailor by bailing him out of jail and also taking him on his boat the very next day. The Latvian said he owes him a debt and they'll see each other again, which they actually do. Several years later, he hires him as crew on his boat. The boat is rat infested. They're carrying stolen property, essentially smuggling it. The people who it was stolen from catch up with them and attack them. Eventually, through sheer force of numbers, will defeat the captain and his sailors, many of whom are wounded. At first, they start to finish off the wounded, but then noticing how many rats there are, they decide to leave the animals to finish off the wounded. This is when the Latvian, in a huge effort, will drag himself to the edge of the boat, start to whistle, and as the rats all come towards him, he will jump in the water and the rats will follow him. A retelling of the Piper of Hamelin, but on a boat. An interesting little twist. It's well told, but nothing super memorable. And this is followed by The Machine from Outside by Don Howard. This one, clear science fiction. The narrator witnesses a meteor land, investigates it briefly with a friend of his who's a professor. It actually landed on the professor's property. He has found some strange metals in other meteoritic rocks, and this metal is immune to acid apparently. So his plan is to take the meteor, dissolve it in acid, and hopefully be able to find some of this metal in larger quantities than the trace amounts he's found so far, in which he thinks it's a new element. And he does find the metal, except instead of just being randomly distributed, it is actually a machine that was embedded in the rock somehow. The narrator and the professor will activate this machine. They will find themselves on another planet under different stars. In fact, it orbits a binary star. When they arrive, the machine is broken. They will do some exploring and encounter what seem to be some spirits or something. They're not sure what. The narrator is quite scared and worried about what he's seeing. He wants to go back to Earth. And when they get back to the machine, they find it has been fixed and they decide to operate it again. At the last moment, the professor decides to bail out, tells him maybe one day I'll come back, but there's too much to see here, I can't leave. The narrator will end up back in the professor's house, unconscious, and when he wakes up, he's in a hospital and he finds out that he was rescued from a fire in the professor's house, but strangely enough, the professor's body was never found. I like this story. It's got some really fun imaginative thing. The machine embedded in the asteroid that once you dissolve it in acid leaves only the machine. That's kind of neat. Traveling to another planet, seeing that the constellations are different. Two suns rise up. Really great foreshadowing of what some more hard science fiction would do later. Next, we have Dr. Grant's Experiment by H.A. Nuruddin Addis. This story starts in a train where the eponymous doctor is traveling. He's being asked by a member of the staff to please come to the luggage compartment because his trunk is actually bursting open. It's going to fall apart. They won't be able to handle it. He's given a piece of rope so he can tie it up. The staff member then leaves the luggage compartment. In there, the doctor finds 4 coffins. He decides to open them. 3 of them contain very mangled body. The 4th one is actually in much better condition. He recalls that recently there had been a train accident. 4 hobos were killed, and he assumes that that must be them. And since they're hobos, nobody's going to miss them. And he decides to transfer most of his luggage into the coffin and the body into his trunk so he can bring it home for an experiment of his, which is to try to bring the body back to life. He works at this and eventually apparently succeeds. His neighbor, who was somebody very much into astral projection and metaphysics and things like that, it's not 100% successful. The person's mind seems to be gone. He just sort of sits around doing nothing, kind of like a vegetable a bit. One day he wakes up to find that the patient, if you will, is gone. And simultaneously he finds out that his neighbor, who was into astral projection and metaphysics and things like that, passed away the night before. The story then cuts to the wife of one of the 4 victims, who was not a hobo, recognizing her husband on the street, trying to talk to him, realizing he's lost all his memory, asking what name he's using. He goes, "Oh, I just gave the first name that came to mind," and it's the name of the doctor's dead neighbor. This story was a little bit all over the place. The conclusion is supposed to surprise you, but we've seen more surprising tales in the pages of this magazine before. Next is Tea Leaves by Henry S. Whitehead. This is about a schoolteacher who has finally managed to save up enough money to do a European trip, visit all the cultural places in Italy and France and England, etc. And she also saved up enough money to purchase gifts for all her family and close friends. And she's even set aside a little bit of money to purchase herself a little something as a souvenir. On the ship, on the way there, she enjoys drinking tea and reading the tea leaves. She repeatedly gets the word beau, the number 47, come up in her tea leaf readings for herself. She doesn't quite know what it means. In the last few days of her trip, she's in London. She will take a shortcut to get to where she wants to go, and she sees an old shop. She decides to go in. She notices that the street address is number 47, and it's on Bow Lane. She will then purchase a small necklace of pearls, which she assumes are actually fake because of the cheap price. She will go home, get back to her regular life. The following Christmas, she's at a party. There's a young man there who seems to take an interest in her. Eventually, he will ask her about where she got the necklace she has. He works in the jewelry trade and he thinks it could be worth quite a bit of money, but he says you should get it appraised at a big jeweler store. They will appraise it, offer her a huge amount of money, $6,000. But they say you should go to this other store in New York, this big place. They have an expert on pearls. We offer this and this will stand, but they might actually value it at more. We're just not sure. She decides to take the trip and get it appraised. And it turns out to have been stolen from the British Museum in 1801, so over 100 years before. And the jeweler offers her $250,000, which she will accept. She gets back home, and she gets a message from the young man asking if he could meet with her. She decides that, she might just marry this man. More of a unlikely happenstance happening to someone who is a little bit odd but quite nice, so you kind of don't begrudge her good fortune. It could have had a little bit more drama to it, though. The next story is An Egyptian Lotus by Mrs. Chetwood Smith. In this one, a young journalist is sent by his paper to Egypt to cover the discovery of the tomb of Tutankhamen. He will meet up with some other journalists from other papers. Some are older, they will give him some advice. He will also run into a young woman. Of course, it's kind of love at first sight. She drops the lotus of the title, a blue flower. He will then get another one of these flowers with a message asking for help. He will follow up on this, be attacked, robbed of all his possessions, left tied up in the middle of nowhere. He manages to make his way out and meets with the original young lady, and it's discovered then that she had some interest with him, which is why she had dropped the flower. However, somebody had observed the scene and saw they could take advantage of him that way, and it was all a scheme to steal his possessions from him. He has met her. Turns out her dad owns several newspapers, and since he believes the inciting incident was his daughter's actions, he will offer the young man a job as a reporter. So everything ends well for him. This is a little bit of a disappointing tale in that there's nothing actually supernatural. It's just a straight up adventure tale in which the main character is more a victim of circumstance than anything else. He is a little bit naive, but he's not a complete fool either, so characterization was good, but he just follows the script, as it were. Deep Sea Gang by Arthur J. Messier concerns two federal agents on vacation somewhere in the Caribbeans when one of them spots a known smuggler, someone he's tried to arrest before but failed, while the smuggler seems to just be playing the tourist, doing some deep sea fishing, going after tuna, swordfish, and other big catches. They suspect he's somehow involved in some smuggling, and they will ask around and do some investigating, and they find that the smuggler will be bringing his catches to a taxidermist with some very specific instructions on how they're to be mounted. Just when they're about to catch him is the night when he is planning to move all his stock. And what he's done is snuck one night into the taxidermist's shop and put some drugs inside the fish. And the idea is to have the taxidermist finish mounting them without knowing that and then bring those into the US along with the drugs. But of course, the good guys catch him in the act and manage to arrest him. Nothing much weird in this one. Your standard detective/action story. This is followed by The Soul Mark by H.C. Wire. This is about a man who is, by his own admission, a bit of a scaredy cat. He has a friend who's come back from, I think, Africa or someplace like that, who tells him a story about a pouch he's brought back, and he claims it's made from the skin of a native. There's a mark on it. He says this is branded on the person while they're alive. He asks his friend if he wants to keep it for a while. It's been haunting him. He's not been sleeping well. And the friend eventually agrees to that. He seems to see signs that the whole story is real, that there's something supernatural with this pouch. Eventually, he will overcome his fear and deal with it. And the coda of the story tells about how his friend is actually a psychologist and told him this story and faked all the events to make him confront his fears. I didn't particularly enjoy this story. Anyone who would take that kind of a pouch made out of that material is deserving of any punishment that would come his way, and that kind of left a bad taste in my mouth. Next is It by E.M. Samson. It's the story of a surgeon who's drafted into the army along with a friend of his. He is, of course, working on the medical staff, and his friend, who was a lawyer, is working on the intelligence staff. He's present when they have to interrogate a prisoner. His lawyer friend tells him, this is a perfect opportunity to test out your theories. Why don't you? He refuses, to which his friend tells him he's a coward for not doing that, since all is fair in love and war, and this is war, and we have to do everything we can. We then discover what his theories are about, is that apparently he's discovered an area of the brain which, if you were to remove it, would remove memories. While they're in France, the doctor runs across a young woman, will fall in love with her, and he spends some time with her, though he never overtly states that he loves her. She's got a lot of admirers, and one day he's taken quite by surprise when his lawyer friend announces that he will be marrying her. He's very heartbroken over it. He eventually will go back home, meet up with his friend, whom he hasn't seen in quite a number of years. He will decide to have his revenge, and he will excise the part that removes memories from his former friend. And it works like a charm. His friend has lost all his memories. He will give him a fake personality with hypnosis and then will hire him on as a manservant. Little things start to wear him more and more. Eventually he decides to be done with it. Things come to a head when the police come in and they find the doctor with a revolver in his hand, his diary there. They read it and then they inquire, and it turns out the lawyer friend and his wife are still in France, and this was all a hallucination he seems to have had. I like the overall story here, but it could have been told just a little bit better. Just a bit of editing would have really helped this story, I feel. Next is The Man Who Lived Next Door to Himself, which I have done a reading of, so I will direct you to that. I quite like this story. It's imaginative. It relentlessly gets to its final conclusion. This is maybe one of the best stories in this issue, as far as I'm concerned. It's followed by Mystery River by Elwyn J. Owens, which I'm not going to attempt to recount the whole thing. It concerns an airplane pilot who is on a flight across the mountains and his plane crashes. He ends up in a very surreal place. Things are very different from everyday life. It has one of those disappointing endings. It was all a dream. When he wakes up, he finds out he's been unconscious in the hospital for 5 days. It's followed by a very short piece called The God Yuano. This one is the story written by someone who is apparently a medium, and it's from the point of view of the ghost that he is in contact with, which we find out is a native somewhere in the jungle. He talks about how he was chosen for a sacrifice, relates the circumstances of his death, and then how he came to be contacting the living through the medium. Not very interesting, but it was told well enough. Next is The Cellar by Paul L. Anderson. 2 men, one's an artist and the other one's a doctor specializing in psychology. He's got quite a successful practice as an alienist, and he's married a young woman, but his obsession with his practice means that over the years he slowly drifts apart from his wife. His friend, who occasionally visits, will slowly become enamored of the wife, to the point where he decides that he has to leave before anything happens. The day before his departure for Europe, he will go there to say his goodbye, find out his friend is not there, but the wife is. In the moment, they will kiss and, of course, be caught by the doctor, who says it's all right. Being a psychologist, he could see all the signs that many people would have missed, that he knows that he's drifted apart from his wife, so he will offer to divorce her so that after a suitable period, they can both marry. They do this. After a bit of a delay, they will eventually take their honeymoon. They're planning to drive around the Berkshires. Their friend gives them some hints as to where they can go. And then one night, there's a rainstorm. It's night. They still have an hour or two of driving left to do. They see a man waving at them from the road, and it's apparently a farmer who says that his wife has fallen down the cellar and he needs help to get her up. So they decide to go. The couple both go in the basement. However, as soon as they've entered the cellar, the farmer will slam the door on them and lock it. And it turns out that it's a metal door, very solid, and the cellar they're in is bare. There is no wife. They hear through a speaking tube the voice of who they think is the farmer, but it turns out it's the psychologist who says he's taking his revenge. He's not going to do anything to them, but he's just going to leave them there and go away. Leave them to die in this cellar. And then the story is about what they have to endure, the thirst, how they try to get out, but they don't really have anything that they can use. They're slowly dying of thirst after a couple of days. Out of desperation, the man again goes up the stairs and tries to force the door open, and the door just swings open. Turns out that the doctor has left them there, and once they thought they were locked in, he silently pulled the latches, unlocking the door and leaving them there. And that's the end of the story. This was quite interesting. We usually have these stories where somebody gets locked in a room and the story ends from the outside, where, oh, and then the door is locked and they're going to finish their days there. And they don't dwell on what happens and how long it takes, whereas this story does. And you don't know how it's going to end. And then there's this lovely twist ending at the end, which I really quite liked. This was another strong story in this issue. Next is In the Weird Light by Edward Everett and Ralph Howard Wright. This is a bit of a non-story. In it, 2 people barely survive the sinking of an unnamed ship that on its maiden voyage hit an iceberg, float on a small boat for days on the ocean away from everyone else until they encounter a water spout that sucks them into the air, and they end up somewhere underground and they meet 2 people, or actually they're ghosts. They apparently had died 100,000 years before, and they can converse, and basically the rest of the quote-unquote story is a bit of a tour, an explanation of where they are, and a discussion of events on the surface, which these people, even though they claim you can't leave where they are, seem to be quite well aware of. This was mostly just exposition after exposition with almost no events, and it was rather forgettable. It's followed by the last piece of fiction, A Glimpse Beyond by H.M. Hamilton. This is a story of a man who's driving his car with some passengers. He's faced with the choice of either hitting a child crossing the road or crashing the car, and he crashes the car. The next thing he knows, he is floating above the car. 2 passengers have survived. Him and his companion are floating above it. They have a brief discussion. One of the surviving women gets the child to run and get help, and eventually a doctor does arrive and manages to save the narrator, who decides to change his ways. The story ends with him happily married to someone, knowing that there is an afterlife and they can still be together there. Very much a out-of-body story like many, many others, but I will probably forget this one relatively quickly. It's then followed by the Ask Houdini column, where the famous escape artist keeps answering questions people write in. And that's the end of the issue. This was a really long one at 200 pages and so much fiction in it. This has been the Grumpy Old Slan, taking a look at the May 1924 issue of Weird Tales. And I'll see you next time.